Yeah, here we go.
Oh, hey. Hi, everyone. Heidi and I here for Sunday studio time. Welcome. And this actually makes it the fourth broadcast, which means I've actually been home for 4 weeks in a row, which is probably a record for this year. So I'm happy to be able to share what I do in the studio on Sunday. Typically Sundays after we do our errands, Sunday afternoon is the time for me to come down in the studio and paint. And so the last 3 weeks I've done some paintings for you. Last week was a big sky painting, and I want to thank those of you who have purchased the demo or the demo booklet that I have in my Etsy shop. I really appreciate that. So today I thought I would share with you something that I do all the time, and that is rescue a failed painting or unfinished painting or a really bad painting. I've got a friend who calls the unfinished paintings UFOs or unfinished objects, and we talk about, well, what are you supposed to do with all your UFOs? Well, some people like to throw them out. I don't like to throw them out because I don't want to waste any kind of paper. So what I tend to do is just stack them, and I have piles of UFOs. And so every once in a while, when I don't know what I want to paint, I just pull out a UFO and start working on that and see what I can do with it. A lot of times I'll take the unfinished painting or the painting that I just never liked or just didn't turn out, and I'll try to rework it and I'll try to see what I can do to fix it. But other times when it's something like this, I feel like, no, it's not even worth saving, but I don't want to waste the paper, so what I'll do is save the paper. Now, so this is a piece of UArt paper, which means I can reuse this paper. So what I'm going to do for today, and by the way, I have some other things that I want to share with you, but I'll get started on the demo because I'm going to be using some rubbing alcohol, so it's going to get wet and it'll need to dry. So then we can have some question and answers while we're waiting for the alcohol to dry. So the first thing that I'm going to do with this UFO is take this painting, which I was trying to think, probably did it about 5 or 6 years ago maybe, and I'm going to just brush it off. So I'm just using an old stiff bristle brush, and I'm brushing it off so I can get a lot of the pastel removed. Because I want to have, if it's on there too thick and then I wet it with the rubbing alcohol, it might get a little bit too gummy and fill up the tooth of the paper. So if I scrub it and remove a lot of that dust, pastel dust, then that'll be less that I have to build up. Now you notice I've got this tray here, I call it a gutter, and this collects my dust so that it doesn't get all over the floor. Alright, so now I've got a good bit of that removed, and what I'm going to do is use some good old-fashioned 70% rubbing alcohol. Love to get these because this means we have to eat the ice cream in order to get the containers, so it's fun. And I'm going to have another old crappy brush, and I'm going to just wet this pastel down, and basically it's toning the paper. I'm still going to have the colors in there, but it's also going to kind of cement this layer in place so that I'll be able to go back over it. I don't want to put it on too wet because I don't want to wait for it to dry forever, and the wetter that you get it, the more chance you have for the paper to get waves in it. So I don't want to make it too wet. And basically what I'm doing here is just creating a base for a new painting. Let's pull some of that green up into here. Try to get rid of some of this blue a little bit more. I'm not painting the same scene, so I want to remove traces of the original scene. Alright, so now we have to wait a few minutes for that to dry.
I have a couple of questions.
So I can answer questions. And
Have you taped it down? Won't it curl?
It's taped down with the white artist tape hinges all over in the corners and in the middle. And usually it's enough to keep it from curling. But if you get it really, really wet, it'll still want to curl. And then when that happens, I just stretch it back out, and then sometimes I have to put it under some heavy books, and then it flattens back out.
And also another question about the pastel dust. Are you worried about the pastel dust?
Well, if you can see that the dust that I used, it fell down into the tray. So it fell straight down. I have this straight up and down. It didn't really go, I'm sure there's some in the air. I mean, but I don't blow on it. I never blow on it, because then you're going to breathe it back in. But if it's falling right down in here, I get rid of it. And the reason why I know I don't generate a lot of dust in my studio is I have a lot of black surfaces. And I don't have to dust but maybe once every 2 weeks, right? So if it's not getting all over the surfaces, then to me it means it's not really all over the air. So that's something that I don't really worry about. I wanted to share something actually the reason why I had this idea to do this for today's demo is someone asked me a question this week, and they said they wanted to know what was an inexpensive sanded paper, because they were new to pastels and they felt like they didn't want to spend the money on expensive sanded papers because they weren't good enough yet. And I get this question a lot with beginners, not only just beginners to painting, but beginners to pastel. You don't want to spend a lot of money till you know you like it, or till you know you're good enough at it that you don't deserve the good expensive stuff. But yet the cheap stuff is harder to paint on. And so it's kind of a catch-22. You get the cheap paper, unsanded paper, but then you're not having success with it because it's a challenge. And yet then you feel like, well, you're no good at it, so you really can't get the expensive paper. But I have a different way of looking at it, in that the sanded paper, especially UArt, is so easy to recycle it and reuse it. And one of the things that I did just for an experiment, let's see if I can take it out of here, is I took a painting and I actually ran it under water in the sink. There's going to be a glare on it. There we go. I ran it under, this was the painting, it was on both sides. I ran it under the sink, scrubbed it with a toothbrush, and I removed just about almost all of the pastel. And you can see I have this very dark Terry Ludwig pastel and some really bright, intense colors. And yet I was able to scrub it off the paper. It did not curl, did not wave, dried perfectly flat. I could have easily removed the other half of the painting and reused the paper. So when artists tell me, well, they don't want to buy expensive paper because they might mess up, if you can wash off your paper and reuse it, that's a lot more cost effective than having cheap paper that you just go through a lot of it and throw it out and not enjoy what you're doing. So I think that's really totally another way to look at it. It's not quite dry. I'll just share with you what I'm going to do for the painting. So what happens when you're recycling a painting and you have this kind of toned surface to work on? What I'll sometimes do is go through my stash of photos and say, what might work for this? Or I might pick a photo first and then pick an old painting and say, oh, how can I transition this into this new scene? So I'm going to do this patch of weeds. This is really basically what it is. I couldn't even tell you what they were. But what I liked about them is not that they were weeds so much as that I love the light on them. There's like a setting sun, and they're kind of just, some of them are glowing and some of them are in the shadow, and I just really enjoyed the whole mishmash of tangled weeds. So I thought, well, that'll be good. That'll be a good base for this. So what I did was, as my usual, I went ahead and selected the pastels that I want to use for the painting. And then again, that just allows me to paint without... I would say they're mostly Terry Ludwig pastels, which those are my favorite. But I always pick my pastels by the color and the value I want, so there's other brands mixed in. They're mostly Terry Ludwig. This one would be a Diane Townsend. this is a unison. So they're mixed in, but I would say the majority of them are going to be terry lovely. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is, it's still a little bit damp, but I can get started on it. And I'm just going to very lightly indicate. I'm trying to decide if I want to. Nah, I'm gonna do this. So I have this thing when I do the flowers and the clouds too. Last week, if something is going to be probably like bigger than an inch when I paint it, I'll go ahead and I'll draw it in when I'm starting the painting. But if something is going to be smaller than that, smaller than say an inch, then I can wait and put in on top of whatever the pastel layers are. So these particular seed heads are going to be larger than an inch, so that I'm actually just drawing them in. And I'm only using the photo just sort of as a jumping off point, sort of as an inspiration, a guideline, a map if you will, and then I will let the painting develop on its own and not really worry about copying it exactly. I want to have the freedom to create these things without being tied to having it perfect in the photograph. So these things, these seed heads, whatever they are the darkest things in this scene. So I'm going to go ahead and block those in right now. And I'm next thing that I want to do is darken some of this area down here around them and where they are kind of coming up. So I want to create a little bit of movement in the painting for these things. So I'm sort of establishing, that's not quite dark enough, let's go back with this one. I want to establish sort of a dark pathway that's going to go underneath all the other grasses and tangles of stuff. So I'm building this painting from the dirt up. So what's underneath comes first, and then I'll build all the grasses and things on top. Now let's see, I want to do some of this. There's some distant trees and things back behind here, so I'm going to go ahead and put those in. And I'm going to use some, I used a grayed down purple, but now I'm going to put in some blue-green. So I have established those distant trees. And now what I want to do is go ahead and put in the sky, because the sky is going to be the lightest part. And I have the darkest. Now I want to put in the lightest just so I can see where I'm going to go with it.
What's that whiteboard you had?
Where? This?
Yes.
Oh, that's just a piece of foam core board. And I just use them and reuse them. You can tell when they get messy that I've obviously reused that one quite a bit. So I'm going to start with a pale peach color, but I want the sky to be a little bit lighter. But I'll start with the darkest color that I think I want. And then I'll get a little bit lighter. And it actually is going to get really more intense right at the horizon, because the sun, I think in this scene the sun had already pretty much, it was behind a tree, gone behind the trees, and so while it wasn't quite set, it was still causing them to glow in the distance just a little bit. Now what I want to do is come back and start rebuilding the tangle of grasses, and in order to have those interesting, I want to first put some color underneath. So I'm putting in, I call this the dirt color. So when I look at it, the grasses are kind of, there's some golden, yellowy, orangey grasses. But I'm going to put down some mauvey violet first. And this will be the dirt color that'll be underneath. So it'll make it a lot more interesting. And then what's happening over here is some of these are kind of in the shadow. So I don't know if I want to put, maybe I'll put I'll put this kind of cooler grayed down violet in here. And I'm going to pull that blue back over because I want to push these things into the shadows. You can see some of those seed heads that I originally set up are starting to disappear, so I'm going to have to reintroduce those into the painting, but for right now it's okay. I had a general idea of where they were going. And a lot of times I'll change their location as the painting develops so that I can create a better sense of movement and pathway for the eye to follow. So I just put them back in there. Okay, let's see. Let's work our way from the back to the front. Put some more of this blue, and this blue-green kind of got lost when I put in the sky, so I'll put that back. A lot of times when I paint, I end up going back and forth over areas, which is why I think it's so important for me anyways that I keep my pastels that I'm going to use, and I keep them all out and I don't have to hunt for them. So that means if I know I have to go back and fix the sky, it's easy enough because I still have the sky color. I don't have to go find it in a box. I'm going to add a little bit of violet up into that sky. I think that's good. Now, let's see, let's work our way from the distant grasses over here. And I'm going to be building up several layers. And I see that the light is kind of peeking in right over here. So it comes in and it cuts in through the shadows right there. So I want to kind of enhance that. Now let's see, did I use this? That's going to be for the seed heads. I'm adding another layer of red violet to these seed heads, the darker ones. I get tempted, and it happens all the time when I paint flowers, wildflowers. I get tempted to want to work on the flowers and get them finished. You know, it's just a natural thing to feel like, oh, you know, I'm painting daisies or I'm painting poppies. I want to get them perfect. But I really try to restrain myself and say, okay, those are the finishing touches. You don't do those first, but save those for the end. So I do a little bit just to make myself happy, and then I say, okay, now come back and refocus and finish the grassy areas and the grassy stuff first. And then you can come back and have fun putting, and what's important is you find out just how much detail you really need. If I were to just keep working on these seed heads, I might end up putting in way more detail than the painting really needs. There's a lot of interesting colors and things happening in this particular patch. So I try to make it easy for myself by picking the colors in advance. And so all I really, I'm limited by this limited palette, but in the end it gives me power because it keeps everything just more harmonious. Because I would be very tempted to keep going in my box and grabbing out more color, more and more color. But knowing that this is all I have and I have to make these colors work makes it a lot easier. And that's going to work my way over to this side here and pull in some of this golden color down into here, just a little bit into the shadowed area. And now there's some greens I want to work with, so I'm going to put in some of those. there, I might end up having an issue with filling the tooth of this paper because I had done the alcohol wash and it really did take away some of the tooth of this paper, and I think this was 600. I'd have to pick it up, lift it to be sure. But a 600, it's 800, even worse. 800 is very fine. So there's not much tooth in 800. So what's going to happen is I am going to be filling the tooth of this paper, and in order for me to continue working, I'm going to have to do some things, which I'll show you, which I don't mind. I do them anyways, usually. Alright, now in the shadowed area, let's start with this color first. There's some whitish flowers or weeds of some sort in this patch, and when they're in the shadow, I'm using this very pale blue-violet color because they're not getting the sunlight, so they're not going to be white. But as they emerge into the sunlight, right over in here, they start to become brighter and whiter, but I'm not going to use white. I'm going to use a very pale value that looks like it's almost white. It's not, but it's not really white. It's a very, 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 very pale pink, almost white. And I'm only going to use it where these little white flowers emerge from the shadowed area. And this right in here. Painting the wildflowers is really enjoyable for me because there's no right or wrong way to do it. There's something very freeing about playing with them and arranging them in ways that make interesting composition. Alright, I'm going to work a little bit more on these seed heads. I'm going to darken them even more than I have, so I'm using the darkest pastel that I have without going to black, and it's a Terry Ludwig, probably the eggplant, really, really dark, rich. And then once I have that in place, I'm going to add a little bit of more of this red violet. And right now I'm treating them kind of as if they were equal, but what'll have to happen is I have to then decide which ones are going to be the star and which ones that are going to have more importance. And those are the ones that I will add more detail to and refine more. So I'm just adding a little bit of that peachy color to the tops where they're getting some of that sunlight. A little bit of that. That guy won't get it. He's in the shadow. Now, they need to have more of the grasses and they need their stems. So I'm going to go ahead and put their stems in first, and I'm going to use which one is this? It's a new pastel. I think it's a dark blue or dark green. So when you're making the stems for the wildflowers, well, I don't want to end up with balloons. So it's so easy to go in and draw these big straight lines and end up with balloons, especially these round flowers. So what I want to do is really relax myself and draw what I call a lyrical line. And that's a line that just skips and is not the same. In other words, I don't keep the same pressure on the entire time that I'm drawing it. So I kind of press and release and press and release. And which way should this stem go? Let's bring it off to the side a little bit. So when this board's not sure, a lot of times we end up drawing lines that are too straight and regular, and we end up with flowers that look like they're at the end of a stick instead of balancing on a delicate stem. And I'll just add a few more that maybe they're not attached to anything. And I'll come in and add a little bit of that sunlight color on the edges of some of these. Oops. And now what I want to do is finish in and by putting a few more grasses that so it looks a little bit more scrubby. So what I'm going to do is take my workable fixative, and again I'm using the Blair Low Odor, and I'm going to spray it. And sometimes I like the spray to make blobs. So I'm going to go close and let little blobby things happen. And you would think, oh my gosh, that's like scary. Like, why would you do that? Why would you make little blobs on your... By the way, that's what fixative can do when you spray it. If you don't have a nice even spray, you can very easily get blobs, which is why I never spray a final painting. But this is part of this whole idea of trying to create a feeling of texture. So when I do that, and then when it starts to dry, it just, when I go over it, it just kind of skips over, and those little blobs kind of become part of the painting.
What brand was the stems?
What?
The stems, what brand was that?
That's just a new pastel. I think it was a dark blue or dark green. So now I'm going to just come in and with the edge of this pastel here, I'm going to draw in some more of those lyrical lines. I didn't really use very much of the green, so, and there is some nice greens in here, so I'm going to go ahead and put in some green things that we can say that suggested leaf shapes. If you ever looked at a tangle of wildflowers or weeds, you know you see all kinds of things in them, all different kinds of shapes and sizes of and colors of things. So I selected these pastels in advance when I had on my thinking brain, so that when I'm here painting, I can just simply respond and say, oh, okay, you picked that, you must have had a reason. Because sometimes once I'm painting, I don't remember why. That's why I like to do these things in advance, the things that require me to stop and think. Let's see. Oh, I think before I do that, I want to really increase that that glow. So I'm going to come back over here. Uh-oh. That's okay. And I'm also adding a little bit of that glow with this brighter orange on the edges of some of these little flowers, because it's picking up some of that glow, and then it gets even brighter or more intense rather. Excuse me. Pull some of that over. If you did too much, you just go back over it. All right, now I can kind of finish up those grasses. Let's see. Sometimes I'll make grasses by using the edge of a square pastel, so the Terry Ludwig pastels work great for this. So I just kind of drop it and drag it, drop it and drag it, and I get some interesting, more painterly looking grasses than if I just draw them all in. You want to have a little variety. Let's have some of these sunlit ones come in into the sun, and then take the blue and put some of the blue ones in the shadowed area. So you can make use of both. Then sometimes it's fun to play with a little bit harder pastels. I think last week I was using those Russian pastels, but then I thought, well, you know what? I could use some Rembrandts, which are a harder pastel that has this really nice rounded top. So I thought, you know what? That might make nice grasses. I don't want them to all go in the same direction, so why don't I pull some coming in off the side or the edge of the painting? And then I'm looking and I say, well, there's some of these things kind of trail off, so they're not just in one section, so I'll add a few more. Maybe one right in here. And then, let's see, what else do I have in this little container? This is a little bit of a tan one. And then I see, let's see, I want to really reinforce the stem on some of those, because by the time I got in all the grasses, they were disappearing, so I don't want that to happen. And then finally I need to put in my final spicy marks. So I'm going to take this red violet and come in and push a little bit harder in some of these areas so that you can see the color a little bit more. And that would be really, let's see, and add this really bright peachy glow on the tops of some of those, and maybe down a couple of little spots of glow working their way down into the grasses. And then sometimes I'll even go in and draw around them some of the flowers so that they stand out a little bit more. And let's just finish up with the sky. Brighten it up just a little bit more, so a little bit lighter. And I see one more thing that I'm going to do. I'm noticing that up across the sky there's a couple things happening. There's some little flowers that are just kind of bobbing along in the distance. So I'll put a cooler color to put those in there. And there's also some stems and things and grasses that are just peeking up on top. And this just helps give that feeling of the depth, that we're here in the thick of all this tangle, but yet beyond that are trees and things in the distance. So by putting in some of these grassy, darker bits here, it just refocuses that we're in this intimate space. So I'll just add a few of those. And really at this point, it's important that you stop, because as I say for every demo I do, you get to the point where you start making marks and don't know why you're making them. And I heard someone once say, you're painting and nobody's home. And when that happens, it's always a good time to stop and at least step back and reevaluate what you're doing and see if you actually need to do any more. So that's how I take an old piece of paper and resuscitate it. And so if you have any questions about what I've done today, feel free to ask me in the comments. I would love for you to share this video if you know anyone who'd be interested. And thanks again for joining me in my studio. It's been a pleasure to paint with you today. See you next time.